I do want to say about the MDGs. I'm going to talk mainly about finance. But I want to say about the MDGs. I agree with your conclusions, Jan, but don't faff about world, not you, but world. The opportunity really to make a breakthrough on this is actually the Earth Summit, which is in the summer of next year in Rio. And if you remember, the original Rio was precisely the big deal about bringing environment and development together. And that's what we need to do in 2012. And it's certainly possible to develop the kind of targets that both you and Camilla were talking about then. And accelerate the whole process. And all the things you said about equality and so on, of course. I'm going to talk about finance. It's going to take me 5 minutes to get there, so forgive me. I'm representing the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. We have $100 million worth of British and Dutch money to spend on delivering climate-compatible development. The chief executive is Sam Bickersteth, and the alliance of organisations delivering the CDKN includes PwC, ODI, Leeds, South North, FLA in Latin America, and one or two others. Our thing is, you've got to put climate and development together. No point in fixing the climate if you don't simultaneously reach the Millennium Development Goals. But more than that, mitigation and adaptation only provide you with the most tenuous link to what we need to do in order to deliver climate-compatible development. Mitigation is about windmills, adaptation is about dikes, but there's a whole lot of stuff in the development space which will be affected by either climate change itself or the policies we introduce to deal with climate change, which will have a very big impact on the livelihoods of poor people and on our ability to deliver the MDGs. I mean, I'm an agricultural economist. I think about the production possibility frontier and how it will change as a result of climate effects. I think about people responding to that and then changing the world's supply and demand for goods and services, changing the price line and providing new incentives for people. Oh, I forgot to say, these are the two propositions I want to develop. So this is the first one. Here's just a couple of examples, and I have lots of others. Here's a factory, a firm in China called Renesola. Last year, it produced 1.2 gigawatts of solar panels. 1.2 gigawatts is a lot of gigawatts. It's a power station worth of gigawatts. They had revenues of 500 million in 2009, $1 billion last year. Every single one of those solar panels is exported. So this is not about mitigation in China, and it's certainly not about adaptation in China. It's about the world economy changing and new opportunities opening for countries which create, and there aren't many people in the picture, but which create jobs for all the people who are presumably inside in the air conditioning. Here's another example of how climate change and our policy to deal with it will be driving a restructuring of the world economy. We need batteries. Batteries need lithium. Bolivia is sitting on the biggest reserves of lithium in the world underneath the salt flats of the Uyuni in the Altiplano. And Saudi Arabia, I mean, Bolivia is described as the new Saudi Arabia of the post-petroleum age. Here is an enormous transformatory potential for Bolivia, which is not about mitigation in Bolivia and is not about adaptation in Bolivia, it's about something else. So when we talk about climate-compatible development, we need to think about mitigation locally, and we need to think about adaptation locally, but we also need to think in the development space. And the slogan that I'm using these days is think locally, act globally, which kind of turns the conventional wisdom on its head, because you need, if you're running a country, to understand how this works. Now, what does one do about it as a leader in a country? I think there's a general answer and a specific answer. The general answer is that we know that all economic development is disruptive, thanks to Schumpeter, creative destruction. New industries open, old industries close, people move between sectors and services, countries urbanize and industrialize, and so on. Confronted by the additional speed of change associated with climate change and the resource threats that both Jan and Camilla talked about, countries need to be even more ready and even more alert and even quicker to move. Now, we know that there's no recipe for growth. But there is an ingredients list. That's what we learned from the Growth Commission. And a key part of that is to be competitive. So here is the World Economic Forum's Competitiveness Index. I commend it to you because it lists for different kinds of countries the basic factors which drive your ability to compete in the world. I've just come from DFID, and this is a slide I showed them, but they've just narrowed down on 27 countries. Nearly all of them are towards the bottom of the ranking of competitiveness index, and to be low on this chart is good and to be high is bad. And it's not surprising because they're all poor countries. But I did a little exercise yesterday which was to compare their competitiveness index with their human development level. And so the question here is, are countries as competitive as you would expect them to be given their level of human development? And the countries on the right are more competitive than you would expect them to be. The countries on the left are less so. And so some of these countries, India, Rwanda, South Africa, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, surprisingly, are quite good for their level of development. And some of them, Pakistan, Nepal, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Bangladesh, Kenya, Malawi, are not. So a key conclusion is to invest rapidly in building the competitiveness of countries, because the world economy will change, and if you're not absolutely at the front of the wave, you get left behind. Who's going to get the innovator's rent from new technologies? We're doing some work at ODI with KPMG on what we're calling a capability index. This is on the ODI website, which is an alternative to the WEF competitiveness index, which looks at the social, governmental, and economic capabilities of countries, and is going to try and measure those and tell us a story about who is capable and who is not. Now, what's going to drive change? Some of it will be driven simply by market signals from the private sector. But most of it actually will be driven by the policy decisions that are taken by governments and internationally. For example, the feed-in tariff, subsidies for railways as against road, and so on. And a job we have to do and haven't yet done is to collect a basket of policies and analyze them. And I started collecting the basket. I've divided them into the incentive and regulatory framework at the top, public expenditure at the bottom, national, international. And for each of these, we need to ask, is it efficient? Is it effective? Is it consistent with government policy? Is it administratively doable? From all of these, which are the top 3 in Nepal? Which are the top 6 in India that we should be pushing and helping countries to develop? And of course, these are extremely important. I had a quote for solar panels on the roof of my garage. £12,000. It's actually a really good investment because of the feed-in tariff. It's going to yield, if I had the money, more money than I have putting it in the bank. It generates about enough power to power the toaster. 2 kilowatts for £12,000. And you know, you think to yourself, is that worth it? But it is a very good investment. Why? Because we have a regulatory system in place in the UK. We have a Climate Act. We have the Independent Climate Change Committee. We have roadmaps and so on. And this is the territory we need to be in thinking about the MDGs. Which brings me finally to finance. At last to finance. $100 billion is the figure by 2020. And the advisory group on finance was tasked with telling us how to raise it. I wrote a blog and had a vote on my website. And the vote was, should Ban Ki-moon have sent it back for them to have another go? Because much as I admire the people who were on the panel, I think they wrote a PhD thesis and not a blueprint or even a set of proposals that the world could discuss. Their matrix of interventions is all down here, and they did a great job in listing and analysing and describing these interventions. What they didn't do is tell us which ones we should choose and how to do it. Just one example, there's a carbon price used throughout the report of $20 to $25 per tonne by 2020. If you look at today's price on the European emissions trading scheme and use an inflation adjustment, that's about the price today. And the price today we know is much too low because they overissued permits in this round of the emissions trading scheme. I asked somebody on the panel why it was 20 to 25, and the person said, that's easy. I wanted 50, the Americans wanted 0, so we compromised. We have a lot of work to do, but I recommend the appendices to the report, which I'm told are very good. And there's some other very good work on climate finance.
much of it at ODI, which Neil, I'm sure, will talk about, the website on tracking and measuring climate funding updates, and some work I very much like, which was carried out by the World Economic Forum, supported by PwC, on how to scale up low-carbon infrastructure, with case studies in South Africa and India and somewhere else, and a lot of discussion about how you manage the balance between private and public sector funding. I've listed here 7 issues which I think are relevant to this. As a preliminary, it's a consequence of my earlier argument that if all the money is spent on climate-related issues, mitigation and adaptation, it will miss the point. We need 100 billion to invest in solar cell factories in India that will export to Germany, and in developing the salt flats in the EU, not just in building dikes in Vietnam to protect people from the rise in sea level. I think we have to see this climate funding as part of a much bigger package. So what are the 7 issues? Yes, monitoring, and that's something that Neil's been very much involved in, both public and private. The question of additionality. Is this going to be new money? New and additional, is that what it was in the Copenhagen Accord? Almost certainly not. The European Commission was supposed to produce a communication on climate change just before Christmas. They had to pull it because they couldn't agree on wording that would explain what was meant by additionality and whether aid would be additional. I'm fairly convinced that ministers around the world will look at Andy Sumner's figures that 72% of the poor, 74%, whatever it is, live in middle-income countries, and they will say, those countries don't need money, fragile states can't spend money, let's spend the money on climate instead. And there's a real risk that we'll be taking aid money from the poorest countries in Africa and using it to subsidize innovation in middle-income countries elsewhere. That needs to be settled. The architecture people have talked about already. These can't be aid funds. They need to be democratically owned and controlled, and they are transfer payments, not aid. That has implications for how we handle conditionality. And there should, in principle, not be conditionality, painful though that will be for the donors. And then the 3 issues on the right, which are really critical to the future and are only just beginning to be discussed. Let me work up from the bottom. First of all, absorptive capacity. We had such a debate in 2005 at the time of the Gleneagles Summit about whether developing countries could usefully spend the additional resources that would come if people met those commitments. And there were a large number of people at ODI who thought they couldn't, and indeed thought that aid was part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I used to sit in staff meetings here and say, do you really want me to go and see Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and say, you know, thanks a lot, guys, but don't bother? And the answer was usually yes. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. 100 billion is a lot. And are the risks of Dutch disease? What are the administrative issues of managing that kind of money, even if a lot of it is private sector? Usage. We have some tough choices to make about spending priorities in countries in these 3 circles: mitigation, adaptation, and development. And here's just one example from Michael Anderson, the DG at DFID. They offered West Bengal 2 options: 9 schools which were cyclone-proofed, or 10 schools which were not, with a strong recommendation that they should take the 9 schools which were cyclone-proofed. The Chief Minister flatly refused. He absolutely wanted, for political and discount rate types of reasons, to have the 10 schools because education was an urgent priority. Of course we can rebuild the Thames barrage and build dikes that will protect us against most tsunamis, but how much do we spend on this and when? And I do strongly advise you to look out for the DFID humanitarian review, the Paddy Ashdown review, of which I'm a member, which is being published on Monday, in which I imagine that resilience will be a major theme. And how do we get resilience at the right level and in the right way into development programs? And what we know about poverty is, of course, it's about security as much as it is about levels of income. And then finally, leverage. This is the hot topic in the climate finance community, because it's about where, how much of this money, this 100 billion is going to be public and how much is going to be private, how the two work together, and how we can maximize the leverage. And it's discussed in this WEF report, but there's a lot of other stuff on it as well, and it's in the appendices to the Advisory Group on Finance report. The number, to my huge surprise, that is used is 18 to 1. every pound of public money should leverage 18 pounds of private money, and that this is a feasible target which can be delivered. And a lot of it is about using blended finance in a development context. It's about working with the multilateral development banks, including the regional development banks, to use public money to kind of provide a seal of approval for larger private investments in the way that the IFC does. And then there's a lot of very new thinking going on, which frankly I don't understand, but which I expect Neil does and some of you will, which is about how you can use public money to buy risk instruments which will reduce the risks facing the private sector. I mean, you can insure apparently against anything. Country political risk, regulatory slippage risk, devaluation risk, and the more you remove the risk, the more you're able to attract private investment. Of course, you have to ask, what's in it for the public sector, and how much do you want to cost the private sector, and how much risk should they expect to be exposed to? This is a huge topic. 100 billion is an awful lot of money, and it needs to be thought about seriously. Finally, just on CDKN, there are two people in this picture, one of whom we have exploited his photograph for publicity purposes, and the other appears to be an African farmer working in a plantation. The person on the right is Sam Bickersteth, who is the CEO of this very large new DFID and Dutch project. There's a website. I commend it to you because we have streams of work on climate financing, on climate compatible development planning, on how to use scenario planning, on the politics of managing climate and development planning together, on agriculture and climate change, and on a number of other things, energy. We're working in something like 30 countries. We have a technical assistance window, a research window, which is currently open, by the way, and a knowledge management and a partnership window. There are lots of opportunities for the community to participate in this, and we're only allowed to spend 25% of the money on ourselves. So if you're at all interested in this topic, look at the website, contact Sam, and let's find a way of delivering together climate-compatible development.